A seemingly ordinary situation, a black woman being misjudged, unfolds into a piercing lesson for society on prejudice and the dangers of judging someone solely by their appearance. This story is a breathless journey through bias, silent power, and retaliation that never needs to scream, because the most powerful form of resistance is dignity and emotional control. Follow the story of Ariana Whitmore and witness how true respect doesn't come from leather shoes or a gold watch. It comes from holding your dignity, especially when others try to strip it away. The scent of jet fuel blended with a trace of ocean salt hung in the morning air as Ariana Whitmore, a 42-year-old black woman, stepped out of a black SUV and headed straight toward the private jet waiting on a runway. No one paid her any attention, and Ariana was used to that. The Skymaster V900, one of the most sophisticated private jets in existence, reflected the rising sun off its sleek aluminum shell. Its spacious cabin, cream leather seats, and polished walnut trims had all been handpicked and signed off by Ariana herself. But to the outside world, Ariana, in dark jeans, a crisp white shirt, and her natural curls tied neatly back, looked like a lucky passenger or maybe someone's assistant tagging along. She tugged her navy blue blazer tighter around her as the ocean breeze from Seabrook Executive Airfield swept across the still cool concrete. As she climbed the steel steps onto the jet, her low heels clicked rhythmically, each step quiet yet unwavering. Ariana needed no door held open, no greeting party. She had lived long enough with power to understand that the strongest presence is sometimes the one no one notices, until they have no choice but to. Inside the cabin, everything was still. She placed her small bag beside her favorite seat, the second row on the right, next to the window, the seat she had occupied on hundreds of flights, made million-dollar decisions from, and sometimes quietly cried in after texts no one ever saw. This was her space. But today, that space was about to be challenged. She slipped off her blazer and draped it over the armrest, revealing a shirt with no designer label or dramatic cut. Sitting down, she exhaled softly and glanced at her watch. 6:12 a.m. She was 48 minutes early, just like always. No one on the flight crew ever arrived before she did. Not because they were late, but because Ariana Whitmore was always ahead. This morning's flight from Seabrook to Phoenix was nothing out of the ordinary, just the annual board meeting of Whitmore Air Group, a report, a few slide decks, some performative questions from shareholders, and perhaps a quiet dinner on the return leg. She used to call it the perfect boring day. But this time, before the wheels even left the ground, a cold voice sliced through her thoughts like a sudden gust. "Excuse me, who are you? Who gave you permission to be up here?" She turned around. A flight attendant, dressed in a pristine Navy uniform, was walking toward her with a wary look. Ariana lifted her chin slightly, her deep brown eyes calm but alert. She was used to that question. But no one ever gets used to what happens after. Ariana Whitmore slowly stood up, her expression composed as her gaze met the woman approaching her. On the nameplate pinned to the flight attendant's chest, Heather Collins, sharp jawline, piercing eyes scanning Ariana as if she were an intruder who'd wandered onto the wrong aircraft. "You're not authorized to be here," Heather said. Her voice clipped and metallic. "This is a private flight. This jet is the property of Whitmore Air Group. Are you on the guest list?" Ariana raised an eyebrow, partly in disbelief, mostly in familiarity. That particular tone, dressed in civility of protocol, was all too familiar. She replied calmly, "I don't need to be on the guest list. I'm the one who approves it." Heather crossed her arms. "Right, everyone says there's somebody. But to me, you're just a trespasser." The cabin was still empty. No witnesses, no cameras, just one moment. One that seemed small now, but will become something much bigger. "Do you understand this is a breach of protocol?" Heather continued. "I'll call security right now if you don't step off this aircraft." Ariana looked her straight in the eye. "I'm Ariana Whitmore, owner of the Skymaster V900. I'm also the CEO of Whitmore Air Group, and you're standing on my jet." Silence dropped like a curtain, but instead of showing confusion or even apologizing, Heather smirked. "I don't care who you say you are. A real CEO wouldn't dress like that. They don't wear $30 watches and carry unbranded tote bags. A heat rose from Ariana's neck to her cheekbones, but her voice remained steady. "I don't believe dressing simply makes me less capable. And frankly, you have no right to judge anyone based on how they look." "Then let security decide," Heather snapped, her hand reaching toward the radio clipped to her belt. Ariana took a measured step back, not out of fear, but clarity. "You really want to call security to remove the person who signs your paycheck?" A beat passed. Heather froze. But then, as if rising to a challenge, she stepped forward, and in a flash of unprofessional impulse, grabbed Ariana by the arm and yanked her hard. No one said a word. There was no scream. But the grip crossed a line, and both women knew it. Ariana hadn't even had the chance to respond, hadn't said another word, when Heather Collins's pent-up outrage exploded in the worst possible way. Smack! The sharp crack of the slap echoed to the luxurious cabin like the verdict of a wrongful trial, bouncing off the sleek leather walls with brutal finality. Ariana didn't fall. She didn't scream. She simply tilted her head slightly from the impact, then slowly turned back, her gaze now molten steel, as she stared directly at the woman who had struck her. No one made a sound, not even a breath. In that split second, the entire cabin seemed to freeze in time. Passengers began to board. A young man in a light gray suit stepped through the entrance, holding a steaming latte. He froze mid-step. The coffee cup slipped from his hand, spilling hot brown droplets across the ivory carpet. A middle-aged woman in sunglasses, holding her son's hand and toting an Hermes bag, stepped back in confusion, as if witnessing a car crash in the middle of serene stillness. Heather remained rooted in place, face pale, her hand still trembling from the slap, as if she couldn't believe she'd actually crossed that line. But every eye in the cabin was now fixed on her, and none of them looked forgiving. Ariana stood tall, slowly raising her hand to touch the side of her face. Her left cheek now burned, a vivid red mark blooming across her skin. She said nothing. She didn't have to. Her silence echoed louder than any scream. Outside, the low rumble of another Skymaster preparing for takeoff provided a distant backdrop. But inside, the world had shrunk into something far more intimidating. It was a world filled with stunned silence, quiet disbelief, and the growing weight of consequence. A young passenger discreetly raised his phone, capturing everything. Another whispered, "Who is she?" And a man in an Armani suit leaned toward a seatmate, murmuring, "She just slapped the owner of the entire airline." Only now did Heather's expression begin to shift. The reality of what she had done, the magnitude of it, finally began to register. Ariana slowly bent down and picked up her navy blazer from the seat where she'd placed it earlier. She brushed off an imaginary speck of dust from the lapel and slipped it on, as if rearming herself with the composure and authority that had always been hers. Then she turned to Heather. "I won't say another word," Ariana said, her voice low, steady, and colder than the tension in the cabin. "But you've just made a mistake that will follow you for the rest of your life." One slap had lifted the entire aircraft into a chilling altitude of silence, and the response, unspoken but inevitable, was already forming. The cockpit door swung open. A tall man with a bronze complexion and neatly groomed salt and pepper hair stepped into the aisle. Captain Marcus Doyle, veteran pilot of 6 years with Whitmore Air, wore a sharply pressed uniform and a face carved in stern resolve. He had just seen the final moment play out through the internal camera feed. But when his eyes landed on the woman who had been slapped, he stopped short, his entire demeanor shifting. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, stunned, his voice laced with both disbelief and unmistakable respect. The entire cabin seemed to flinch at once, like it had just been struck by lightning. Marcus took 2 firm steps forward, positioning himself squarely between Ariana and Heather. "She is Ariana Whitmore," he said, pronouncing every syllable with weight. "Chairwoman and founder of Whitmore Air Group." Heather snapped her head toward him, eyes wide, face drained of color. What did you just say?" A gasp rippled from the back of the cabin. A young passenger dropped into a seat, face pale as porcelain. Another scrambled for his phone, fingers fumbling as he opened a browser to search the name. 10 seconds later, a screen lit up, clear as day. Ariana Whitmore, the billionaire behind Whitmore Air Group. Heather froze. like a wax figure cracking under heat. The same hand that had just delivered a slap was now visibly trembling. Her lips parted as if to explain, but no words came out. Every excuse she might have offered had died before reaching her tongue. Ariana hadn't moved. She stood like a marble sculpture, her expression unreadable, lips sealed, but her eyes? Her eyes delivered a sentence more devastating than any outburst ever could. Captain Marcus turned to her, eyes steady, voice calm. "What would you like us to do, Ms. Whitmore?" Ariana slowly reached into her handbag, not for a phone, not for documents, but for a small black velvet box. Inside was an old enamel pin, the original employee badge of Whitmore Air Group. Her voice was calm, low, but every word landed with the precision of a gavel. "I personally handed out this badge to the first people who believed in my vision," she said. "I never imagined that 20 years later I'd be mistaken for an intruder on a very dream I built from nothing." Suddenly, an older man stood from his seat. He rolled up his sleeve to reveal a tattoo, the original Whitmore wings, etched into his skin. "I was the first pilot you hired for the test route from Miami to Houston. Back in 2005, he said. If you'd like to proceed with disciplinary action against this flight attendant, I will testify." The cabin erupted in hushed murmurs. Heather looked around. Nowhere to hide. Nowhere to run. Ariana took a long, measured breath, then turned to Captain Marcus. "I'm not here to destroy anyone," she said. "But I'm not here to stay silent either." Her voice hardened slightly. "Starting today, every employee will be retrained on a simple concept. Respect is not determined by appearance." The silence that followed wasn't stunned. It was reverent. Ariana walked to her seat and sat down with effortless grace, as if she had never been disrespected, as if she still commanded the sky itself. Heather, trembling, stood behind the captain, unable to meet a single eye in the cabin. What happened next was no longer about a slap. It was a shockwave of truth finally being acknowledged. Captain Marcus looked to Ariana for instructions, but she simply gave a small nod, then turned to Heather with a calm that was more terrifying than rage. "You'll remain on this flight, Heather," Ariana said, voice calm and steady. "But today, you'll relearn what it means to serve. Not because I need to be served, but because you need to learn how to do it with respect for someone you once dismissed." Heather swallowed hard. "Why, yes, Ms. Whitmore." Ariana turned her face away without another word. She fastened her seatbelt with a slow, fluid motion, leaned back into the leather seat, and let her gaze drift out the window. The plane began to taxi, rolling steadily from the stand toward the runway. The flight had officially begun. But it wasn't just a trip from Seabrook to Phoenix. It was a journey weighed down by one of the most powerful lessons ever witnessed inside a cabin. Heather stood behind the beverage cart, her hands trembling slightly as it neared Ariana's row. Passengers glanced at her, some with mild surprise, others with quiet curiosity, as if they were watching a public exam in humility unfold at 35,000 feet. "What would you like to drink, ma'am?" Heather asked softly, her voice barely louder than wind through a cracked window. Ariana opened her eyes, and with a gaze sharp enough to slice through performative remorse, she replied, "Water, room temperature, no ice." Heather fumbled with the bottle, nearly spilling it as she poured. A few passengers stifled chuckles. Others simply shook their heads, silently absorbing the shift in power, as the woman they'd seen humiliated now commanded the entire cabin, without ever raising her voice. Across the aisle, a little girl leaned over to whisper to her mother, "Mom, who is that lady? Why is everyone looking at her?" Her mother smiled gently, whispered back, "She's someone you should never judge by the clothes she wears." At the front of the cabin, Captain Marcus Doyle kept one eye on the overhead camera. There was no need to intervene. He'd flown with Ariana Whitmore before. He knew her style of leadership. She never used power to crush. She used presence to reflect. When Heather placed a glass of water on Ariana's tray, Ariana looked up, and with no malice, no sarcasm, she simply said, "Thank you, Melinda." Heather nodded quickly. It's my honor." No rebuke, no sharp smile, just a thank you. Yet somehow, it landed like a revelation, like a mirror held up to Heather's conscience. She wasn't scolded. She was seen. The wheels touched down in Phoenix with a dull, final thud. It sounded almost like a verdict. Heather stood near the cabin door, hands gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles turned white. She was no longer the cold, control woman from a few hours earlier. Now, she was just a flight attendant standing at the edge of a reckoning she had created for herself. Passengers filed out of the cabin one by one, yet many turned their heads back, eyes heavy with confusion, curiosity, or even disappointment. No one whispered anymore. Everyone knew. Something serious had unfolded between the woman in the navy blazer, seated calmly in the second row, and the flight attendant who now couldn't lift her head. Once the final shadow disappeared behind the exit, the atmosphere sank once more into weighted silence. Ariana Whitmore hadn't moved. Not yet. She stood slowly, slipping her blazer over her shoulders as if preparing to step onto the stage of a global summit. No rush, no spectacle, just purpose. Heather swallowed hard, struggling to steady her breath. But then, the cabin door swung open, and there stood the last person she wanted to see. Clarence Hayes, Regional Operations Director of Whitmore Air, appeared at the top of the stairway, clad in a charcoal suit, frameless glasses, and holding a sleek tablet. His gaze scanned the cabin, paused briefly on Ariana, and then settled on Heather with a look impossible to read. He didn't need to say much. His presence alone made the back of Heather's shirt damp with sweat. "Good morning, Ms. Whitmore," Clarence said, his tone calm, composed, and unmistakably firm. Ariana nodded with quiet finality. "Thank you for being here. I believe this needs to be handled immediately." Clarence turned to Heather. "I'll need you to disembark after luggage is unloaded. HR and legal are waiting for you in the VIP terminal conference room." Heather opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She nodded, just once, the kind of nod that says she knew this was already over. Ariana descended the steps, her posture unwavering beneath the sharp morning sun of Phoenix, Arizona. Clarence followed silently behind her, never once glancing back at Heather. And Heather, who had issued commands with unwarranted authority just hours earlier, now remained standing with only her ragged breaths, the soft tap of her fingers on the seatback, and her warped reflection in the fold-down tray table for company, a version of herself she no longer recognized. Inside her was chaos. Shame, fear, and something no training manual could ever instill, regret. She stayed frozen, hands at her sides, leaning against the cabin wall as though without it, she might collapse entirely. Ariana's footsteps echoed on the metal stairwell, steady cold like an unspoken verdict. But suddenly, Ariana stopped, 3 steps from the door, 3 steps from Heather Collins. She turned. A gentle breeze swept past, tugging lightly at Ariana's silk scarf, carrying with it the scent of jet fuel, heated steel, and the weight of a mistake about to be judged. Ariana looked at Heather, no fury, no scorn, just the kind of gaze that comes from someone who sees everything and forgives nothing. "Ms. Collins," Ariana said, her voice unwavering, "I won't drag this out." Heather gave a shaky nod, but her eyes were already welling with tears. Ariana stepped forward, her voice still calm. "People might forget what you said to me. They might even forget what you did this morning. But they will never forget the feeling you left behind. For me, for the passengers, and for yourself." The air thickened, frozen in that moment. Her words weren't loud. They weren't long, but they pierced through Heather like a steel pin straight into the heart. Ariana looked at her one last time and said, "The feeling you leave behind, that's a legacy. But I believe the lesson you've learned today can change that if you're brave enough to learn it." Then she walked away. Heather said nothing. She couldn't. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and for the first time in her life, she understood what it felt like to be truly seen, fully, with nothing left to hide behind. Moments later, Ariana Whitmore stepped into the VIP conference suite. She paused just before the door, letting the Phoenix sunlight slash across the carpet like a sharpened blade. Clarence Hayes stood behind her, his face hard, posture ready, as if one nod from Ariana would trigger everything. The paperwork, the dismissal, the HR transfer letter already drafted and waiting in Atlanta. Just then, Heather Collins stepped into the room. Clarence looked at Ariana, awaiting confirmation, but she didn't nod. Instead, Ariana turned to Heather Collins, the woman who had struck her, humiliated her in front of strangers, and brought an entire company's values under scrutiny in the very skies they swore to uphold. And then, her voice rose, not loud, not cold, not angry, but with the quiet weight of someone who has endured and emerged whole. "Ms. Collins, I'm not going to fire you." Heather's head lifted, stunned. Even Clarence shifted slightly, waiting for clarification. "Not because you don't deserve it," Ariana continued, "but because if I fire you now, it'll be too easy for you to blame me, or the system, or the misfortune of a bad morning." She stepped closer, each footfall deliberate. "I want you to go back to work. Walk the terminals you once moved through, without seeing anyone. Serve passengers you used to size up with your eyes before you open your mouth." Ariana stopped in front of her, her voice dropping, firmer now. "And every time someone looks at you and says nothing, their silence will be your mirror. Every lowered gaze, every hesitant smile, that will be your reminder to choose better, to live kinder." A breeze slipped through the doorway, carrying the silence with it, a silence heavier than any termination notice. Because this was no simple consequence. This was reflection, reckoning, and the beginning of something far more lasting. Ariana turned to Clarence and said simply, "Noted in her file, classy infraction, mandatory retraining on conduct and professional standards." Then she turned away, not needing to look back. Heather didn't collapse, but she knew she would never walk the same way again, because the world doesn't need to shout to deliver punishment. Sometimes mercy is a kind of justice that echoes for a lifetime. News of the incident aboard the SMB 900 spread faster than any flight Whitmore Air had ever operated. Within just 24 hours, the passenger-recorded video, from the slap to Ariana Whitmore's final words, had surpassed 4 million views on X, formerly Twitter. Hashtags like hashtag she owns a jet and hashtag respect before assume quickly climbed the trending list nationwide. Major publications such as The Atlantic, Forbes, and Bloomberg all ran headlines with strikingly similar sentiments. It's not about the outfit. It's about the way we judge people before we know who they are. Flight attendants, women entrepreneurs, and countless others who had once been quietly dismissed shared Ariana's story. To them, she became a living emblem of something simple, yet rarely acknowledged: the right to exist without needing to prove your worth. At Seabrook Executive Airfield in Atlanta, a janitor named Jamal was captured on video cleaning the VIP lounge in a worn jacket, with a caption that read, "Before you laugh at the uniform, ask what the person wearing it has built." Ariana's story didn't become a scandal. It became a national lesson, not taught through speeches, but through action. And from that moment forward, every time a black woman boarded a plane in simple clothes, people slowed down a little and remembered Ariana Whitmore, because she didn't lower her voice to earn respect. She kept it steady and made the world listen. The black SUV rolled silently out of the VIP section of Seabrook Executive Airfield, leaving behind curious stares and fading whispers. Inside, Ariana Whitmore leaned her head against a UV-tinted window, her gaze fixed on the fading runway. Her cheek still held the faint warmth of Heather's lost hand. But that wasn't what she remembered. What lingered in her thoughts were the eyes. The eyes that, for the first time, saw her without assumption, without filter, without agenda. On her lap, an iPad remained unopened. In her purse, dozens of unread messages from board members and journalists waited. But Ariana wasn't ready to respond just yet. She needed a moment to breathe. The driver glanced into the rearview mirror. "Everything all right, Ms. Whitmore?" Ariana gave a slight nod. Better than ever. Outside, the traffic crawled on. Women in tailored suits. Fathers juggling calls. Anonymous travelers bustling through an airport she partially owned. And she knew many of them had, at some point, been misjudged by nothing more than what they wore. Ariana smiled faintly, not because she had won, but because a lesson had been planted, quietly but deeply. True respect doesn't come from leather shoes or gold watches. It comes from how we hold our dignity, even when we're dismissed. She didn't need a shout to be heard. She simply refused to lower her head, and with that poised silence, sharp as truth and soft as grace, Ariana Whitmore left a mark no one could erase, not on the ground, but in hearts that finally saw.